sacred tree. So these trees, the shoega, the odumber, the neem, they all were cut down, but the huge banyan tree stood like a problem, whose roots lay deeper than all our lives. And then the poet, he comes to the crux of the matter, and he says that these small trees, all these trees also they are quite large, neem, adumba, etc. But he says that all they were small as compared to the giant banyan tree. And first, the small trees were cut. The poet says that they were not literally cut, but they were massacred. And then there came a problem that how can we uproot or how can we cut this huge banyan tree, because its size was so large that it was not easy to cut this tree, and it seemed nearly impossible. This was a giant task. This appeared to be a Herculean task. How to uh, how to fall this giant banyan tree, and it, as the poet says, that it stood like a problem, and because its roots lay deeper than all our lives. We were small kids when the poet he wrote this poem. His father was there, then he remembered his grandmother. So he says that my one of my great grandparents might have planted this tree. Now its root, they it was not easy to uproot this tree because its roots were deeper than our lives, because we were small and this tree was a giant tree. My father ordered it to be removed, but my father was in a dic- dictator mood, and he did not want to listen to anybody. He did not pay any attention to the sayings of what people would say, and he was in such a mood that he would not pay heed to any advice, any suggestion, and emotionally he was in a different mood. So he did not think of all these factors, and he says that whatever may come, but I will not let this tree remain here for a long time now. So he says, my father ordered it to be removed. At any cost, it should be removed, and I want to see it to be removed at the earliest. The banyan tree was 3 times as tall as our house. The poet moves ahead, and he says that it was not a small tree, and our house was quite large. It was surrounded by some other houses also. All these surrounding houses were removed, all these surrounding trees were removed, but this banyan tree. And then this poet goes on to describe the size of this huge tree, because it is considered that banyan and people, and more specifically banyan tree, it has a uh, its age is quite, it lives for a number of years, and it gives rise to offshoots, and from these roots, new roots, which happens to be offshoots, again new banyan trees, they keep on arising, they keep on growing. So the poet says the banyan tree was 3 times as tall as our house. Now it was such a huge tree because it was a very ancient tree, very old tree, and it was nearly 3 times as huge as our house. Its trunk had a circumference of 50 feet. The poet describes that its circumference, in terms of mathematics, it was not possible to take this tree into arms, because its circumference was nearly 50 feet. So by this by the use of this single phrase, the poet has planted in our brains or in our minds a huge size. So he says that nearly 50 feet circumference. So in this manner, the poet indirectly suggests us its long age. He doesn't say that it was 100 years old or 150 years old, but he simply suggests that it was very old because it had a circumference of 50 feet. Its scraggy aerial roots fell to the ground. Now, the masons, the laborers who come to cut this tree, they start cutting it step by step. So it started with aerial roots. So the aerial roots, it happens in the case of banyan tree especially. As I told you earlier, that these aerial roots, they again give birth to new banyan trees, and this process goes on. So the poet has used this word scraggy. See the use of this word scraggy. Its scraggy aerial roots fell to the ground, and now these aerial roots, they are one by one, they are being destroyed. From 30 feet or so, first they cut the branches. Now the process of cutting this banyan tree has started, and the poet says that nearly from 30 feet or so, first they cut the branches, because they start cutting the branches. It takes time, it's a huge and giant tree, and at the last they will come on to the roots. So he says that nearly its height was nearly 30 feet. So from 30 feet or so, he does not indicate very exactly, but he just suggests that it was nearly 30 feet or so. They cut the branches. They started cutting the branches, sawing them off for 7 days, and the heap was huge. Now, as we have seen that this was a huge tree, so they were chopping the branches one by one, and nearly from the height of 30 feet they started cutting, and then sawing them off. They used a kind of instrument, it is called saw, and because it was a very thick tree, so it was not easy to cut it with swords, and therefore they had to use saw. So the poet says, sawing them off for 7 days, and the heap was huge. This they were cutting wood after wood, branch after branch, and in this manner the whole tree was cut to its size, its huge size. So for 7 days nearly they used saw as the instrument, and the wood, a heap of wood occurred. It fell on the ground. So the heap was huge. Lot of woods, they were collected on the ground, and the poet suggests that this heap of wood, it was very huge. Insects and birds began to leave the tree. Now here you see, a tree is not simply a tree, because a tree gives shelter to different kind of birds, insects, because as we construct our own houses and as we live in colonies and societies and cities, so on these huge trees like banyan, they have the insects, birds, different kind of birds. If you happen to sit under a tree, and especially a huge tree like people or this banyan tree, you come across all these different kind of species of birds which you don't find at other place. So suppose we go to a forest, and there these trees are there, and if we just sit there silently, we come across those kind of birds, beautiful birds, which we don't find in cities. So these trees, they they are basically like they give shelter to birds, insects. So the poet says that when this tree was cut by branch to branch, so all these insects and birds which had been which had taken shelter for God knows how many years and how many generations, now they are leaving this tree one by one. Insects and birds began to leave the tree, and they had come to know, these insects and birds, they had come to know that now no more will they be able to live on this beautiful tree, because the human beings, they are cutting this tree which is their shelter, and therefore, just assuming the end of this tree, they started leaving the tree, and then they came to the massive trunk. The poet started from branches. Now all the branches have been cut. Now the massive trunk, see the use of this word massive. Massive means huge trunk, and it had a circumference of, as the poet has said, nearly 50 feet. So its mass was great, and then after that they come on to the massive trunk rather, and the poet goes ahead. He says, 50 men with axes chopped and chopped the great tree, revealed its rings of 200 years. Now in these concluding lines, the poet is coming on to the conclusion, and he says that now before us a huge trunk, a massive trunk stands, and it was not easy to cut this trunk. It needed a number of persons, and the poet says that nearly 50 men, 50 persons with axes in their hands, they had axes. Now the role of saws had gone, because while cutting the branches they used saw. Now in this huge trunk, no saw will work. Now in their hands they have got axes, and they are attacking this tree in a like butcher, and a single person or a team of 2 or 3 or 7 or 8 will not do, because this is a huge trunk, and as the poet says that a team of 50 men, and in their hands they had axes, and in their axes, with the help of their axes, they chopped and chopped the great tree. And when this tree was cut, it was being chopped, so it showed its age, and the poet says he indicates that the tree revealed its rings of 200 years. Now here we have to understand a simple science, because it's a matter of science, that every tree, just as human beings have their age, when we are child, then we become grown up, we become students, we come to the college, then we become young, and then we become 40, 50, 60, and then we keep on going. Now in this similar fashion, in this similar trend, trees also have their age. But how can we know what is the age of the tree? So this phenomena is called annual ring. So when a tree completes 1 year, it grows a ring around its trunk, and it is called annual ring. Annual ring means it gets a ring annually. So this is something very strange. So this by cutting a tree, when we cut a tree, we come to know of its exact age, that how many years this tree is. Now in the case of this banyan tree, when 50 men with axes, they chopped and chopped. So at the last, what happens? The how many rings are revealed? Nearly 200 rings. That suggests that this tree is nearly 200 years old. The poet goes ahead and he says, "We watched in terror and fascination this slaughter as a raw mythology revealed to us its age." Now, you see the use of these heavy words which poet is using again and again: massacre, slaughter, hmm, terror, because he is not happy by this process. When this tree is being cut, the poet is not feeling happy. We should keep this thing in mind, that he is a small child, and generally when trees are cut, most of the child, they jump in enjoyment because this is something new for them. But here this poet is of that mind that he does not like the cutting of the tree, and he remembers his grandmother, his great grandparents, who might have who might have planted this tree in their garden or in their courtyard. And this his father, because his father does not like this tree, and he has taken this decision to cut this banyan tree. So this process has started, and the poet says that this 200-year-old tree is being cut, and we are small kids,